This meeting of the Finance Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. My name is Councillor Stock and I am the chair of this committee, and good evening everybody tonight.
In answer to Councillor Richards-Jones, you noted that the equivalent 10-year figures for borrowing on the general fund were 134 million, and to those we can add the 200 million in paragraph 33 on the existing stock and 670 million of new borrowing, paragraph 34. So that's already over £1 billion of borrowing, to which then, in terms of the administration's policy, we then need to add the 129 million in paragraph 38 for what's already there. So that's, am I right in thinking that this administration's policy is to incur borrowing of over £1.1 billion?
Yeah, so investment of 1.1 billion funded by borrowing, yes, but investment funded by borrowing. So, as I said earlier, there is an alternative side to that borrowing.
And to Councillor Richards-Jones' point about the lifetime cost, I accept it's one side of the coin, but a coin has the same diameter, no matter which side you're looking at. On the previous basis on which we'd looked at these, borrowing of over 1.1 billion would involve total costs of that debt of well north of £2 billion, more like £2.5 billion. Is that correct?
I don't have the figures on me, but yeah, I mean, so this is the point, I think, that needs to kind of come out quite clearly. If we add up the cost of borrowing on top of the borrowing that we've incurred, it will always be a significant and scary figure. It will always be. If you calculated how much you repay on your student loan, you wouldn't go to university. You know, the number is a scary, scary number. But you invest in that borrowing because you think there will be a financial and non-financial benefit of you making that investment, and that's what we're doing.
I mean, it's quite ironic, given that we're usually lectured by the other side that we shouldn't look at council finances as though they related to household or personal finances, and should look at them on some different basis. I'm sure I've heard Councillor Dikerdem say that in the past, but I do accept Mrs. Mary's point. However, let's just deal with the principle. Let's ignore the cost of a debt interest for a moment. That's borrowing of over 1.1 billion when we are, by the end of this month, going to be plunged into a financial crisis due to the 3-year settlement, which will drastically reduce our funding. Can I ask the Cabinet Member for Finance, given that we are going into a financial crisis to which she has, as of yet, no answer, how it possibly is wise to borrow so much money up front?
Councillor Hanna, just on that question, perhaps Cllr Graham touched on fair funding. Perhaps you could give an update in terms of where we are just briefly, and then answer the question on borrowing. And I don't know if Councillor Dikerdem wants to come in on the policies that sit behind the borrowing, or Mr. Chadwick.
On fair funding, is not ideal, obviously. We do have a transformation programme, and we do have reserves, which buys us time, and we are working on efficiencies. This is manageable. It's affordable. I've said this several times. We review this regularly, and if at any stage this does not look like it's affordable, we will adjust the plans.
The one thing that I find quite tricky from the other side is the cost of our borrowing is a scary number of 1.1 billion. But we're a local authority who, I think, looking at the accounts, have an annual turnover of around £1 billion anyway. And one of the things I think that we can do a disservice to our residents with is putting very scary numbers big numbers in front of them, without giving them the context of what the council actually pays for, what its turnover is, what it funds. It's easy to say this is a large sum of money, but we deal in large sums of money. You look at our accounts, I'm looking at the long-term assets, that's in hundreds of thousands of pounds. 3.2 billion is our assets. That's a big number, and that's the sort of numbers we need to be thinking of and being clear about to our residents that that's the sort of size we deal with.
Firstly, really important to separate the HRA spend and the general fund spend because of the distinct separate pools of money that's coming in through both of those. And as we said, the HRA borrowing is viable. But I do think so that the moral line in question here, particularly in response to the general fund, does relate to the HRA because of the temporary accommodation costs. So, you know, I think we can both agree that the cost of temporary accommodation is a kind of new and appalling phenomenon that is a real drag on the general fund. And therefore, using the financial muscle of the HRA, which I think there is, again, a principle around a public asset, council housing, developing new council housing for the generation, for future generations who can benefit from it. If that also comes with the benefit of trying to reduce the cost of temporary accommodation to the general fund, is a sound and smart financial decision. Now, it's a sound of smart financial decision because the Conservative Party were going to build some new council homes in their own programme. We just disagreed with the level of council housing because you were going to do a cross-subsidy model on the existing land we had. And because land is so rare and finite, and for future generations, we didn't want to have to spend money on buying expensive land. We'd much rather spend it on bricks and mortar. We took the decision to front-load on building the council housing on our public land. So I think those are the key kind of political, moral, philosophical differences around that decision-making, because one was maybe a bit more short-term, and ours is honestly and frankly a long-term. The bit that hasn't been covered, and I think that Councillor Apps's point was really important too, is we have a very ambitious development programme, but we are acutely aware of the age of our stock. And so I think the future strategic questions around balancing capital programme investment in an ageing stock alongside the new build. And I think that's the fault line that Scrutiny is going to be really helpful for, and that I'm taking as the most kind of serious political question facing us over the next couple of years, not worrying too much about the financial risk in what is essentially a mortgage to deliver an asset that generates rental income for the council and performs all the social goods we know council housing does.
Thank you. Cllr Graham?
Well, I mean, Councillor Dikerdem might be surprised to know that I agreed with more than I disagreed with in his answer. And I do agree with his general points on temporary accommodation. However, what is not right to say is that that's a purely financial decision, or that the Council's administration's decision to flip the 1,000 Homes programme is a purely financial decision. In fact, given the build costs on that 1,000 Homes programme, to keep it as it was and instead put the money that is going to have to be borrowed into buying up existing properties would be cheaper. You'd get the same number of social rent units, and in fact you get more social rent units for the same amount of money. And actually, to deal with the temporary accommodation phenomenon, if you're just going on a financial basis, it would be more of what you are in fact doing in Tooting, which is buying up or paying to use a hotel rather than creating social rent units in order to bring that temporary accommodation bill down. It's not very popular in Tooting, I have to say, but the general principle of that you actually use money to extend the number of temporary accommodation properties, that would save more money than going for the extra social rent units. So the fact is that the administration's taken a political choice to go for social rent units than a new build over what is financially most advantageous and would reduce the level of borrowing.
Councillor Dikerdem, and then I'll come to Councillor Belton. I think he was.
So I think the mistake made there is to remove the grant funding that we get from the GLA on the new builds, which I think changes the sums. But there's a strong valid points there. So we have started to purchase and do what we call right to buy back at much higher figures than the previous administration did, because there is a cost involved in it, but we can also leverage in some GLA grants. So we have expanded the right to buy back programme. There is the question I raised about the age of stock. So a new build property with all the EPC ratings and I just have to say they are stunning, amazing buildings that we're building. They have a much longer lifespan. So there's a balancing act to be made. But over the last couple of years, the market in London is falling or stalled for the first time in very, very many years. And there are counter-cyclical moves that you will have seen that we've made, particularly around kind of Section 106 style decision-making. And I think it's absolutely reasonable that we start thinking again about whether we can ramp up the purchasing power of those buybacks. Now, there's always going to be a trade-off between the amount of grant we can leverage in, the use of a site, the value of a new build as opposed to buying an older property, and all the different calculations that are made. But I think we made the right decision to certainly invest in a kind of new generation of stock that will have much less long-term capital work spend on it. But I think the bit of your question that I'm going to accept is that we are, particularly the last year or so, entering a period in which it is a smarter time to really ramp up some of those buybacks, particularly given cost inflation and particularly given the questions of the cost of density on the larger towers. So it's a balancing act, and your scrutiny is always welcome to help us make the right choice. And I like the idea that now you would like us to buy back more council houses as well, rather than opposing council housing. So we can agree on that.